Chapter 15. If destiny once begins to pursue someone with misfortune, there is no end to its blows. That has been noticed long ago. Was the shame and disgrace of the previous day not enough for Marya Alexandrovna? No. Fate was preparing something more, something better. Before 10 o'clock in the morning, a strange and almost incredible rumor was suddenly all over the town, welcomed by all with the most spiteful and venomous glee, as we generally do welcome any extraordinary scandal connected with any of our neighbors. "To be so lost to all shame and conscience," people cried on all sides, "to demean herself to such a degree, to disregard all decorum, so utterly to cast off all restraint," and so on and so on. This was what had happened, however. Early in the morning, a little before 6 o'clock, a poor and pitiful-looking old woman in tears and despair ran up to Marya Alexandrovna's house and besought the maidservant to wake the young lady immediately, only the young lady, and in secret, so that Marya Alexandrovna should in no way hear of it. Zina, pale and shattered, ran out to the old woman at once. The latter fell at her feet, kissed them, bathed them with her tears, and besought her to come with her to her sick Vasya, who had been so bad all night that he might perhaps not last through the day. The old woman, sobbing, told Zina that Vasya himself begged her to go for a last farewell before he died, implored her by all the holy angels, by all that had been in the past, and said that if she did not come, he would die in despair. Zina at once resolved to go, though yielding to this entreaty would obviously confirm all the old malicious gossip about the intercepted letter, about her scandalous behavior, and so on. Saying nothing to her mother, she threw on a cloak and at once hastened with the old woman right across the town to one of the poorest quarters of Mordassov, to the most out-of-the-way street, in which there was a little dilapidated house with little slits for windows, fallen aslant, as it were sunken into the ground and almost buried under huge drifts of snow. In this little house, in a little low-pitched, musty room in which the huge stove filled up half the floor space, a young man was lying covered with an old greatcoat on an unpainted wooden bed with a mattress as thin as a pancake. His face was pale and exhausted. His eyes glittered with a feverish glow. His hands were thin and dry as sticks. His breathing was labored and husky. It could be seen that he had once been handsome, but disease had disfigured the delicate features of his handsome face, which was terrible and pitiful to look at, as the face of a consumptive, or rather of a dying man, always is. His old mother, who had been for a whole year, almost to the last hour, hoping for her Vasya's recovery, saw at last that he was not long for this world. She stood over him, now crushed with grief, but tearless, clasping her hands and gazing at him as though she could never look at him enough. And though she knew it, she could not grasp that in a few days her Vasya, the apple of her eye, would be covered by the frozen earth out yonder under the snowdrifts in the wretched graveyard. But Vasya was not looking at her at that moment. His whole face, wasted and marked by suffering, was full of bliss. He saw before him, at last, her of whom he had been dreaming, asleep and awake, for the last year and a half in the long dreary nights of his sickness. He saw that she had forgiven him, coming to him like the angel of the Lord as he lay at death's door. She was pressing his hands, was weeping over him, smiling at him, looking at him again with her wonderful eyes, and and all the past never to return rose up in the dying man's soul. Life glowed again in his heart, and seemed at parting from him as though it would make the sufferer feel how hard it was to part. "Zina," he said, "Zinotchka, don't weep over me, don't mourn, don't grieve, don't remind me that I shall soon die. I shall look at you, yes, as I am looking at you now. I shall feel that our souls are together again, that you have forgiven me. I shall kiss your hands again as in old days, and die, perhaps, without noticing death. You have grown thin, Zinotchka. My angel, with what kindness you are looking at me now. And do you remember how you used to laugh in old days? Do you remember? Ah, Zina, I will not ask your forgiveness. I do not want to remember what happened, because, Zina, because though you have forgiven me, I shall never forgive myself. There have been long nights, Zina, long sleepless nights, awful nights. And in those nights on this bed I thought for long hours over many things, and made up my mind long ago that it is better for me to die. Yes, by God, it is better. I am not fit for life, Zinotchka." Zina was weeping and mutely pressing his hands as though she would check his words. "Why are you crying, my angel?" the sick man went on. "Because I am dying, only for that. But you know all the past has been dead and buried long ago. You are cleverer than I. You are more pure-hearted, so you have known a long time that I am a bad man. Can you still love me? And what it has cost me to endure the thought that you know I am a bad and shallow man. And how much pride there was in that, perhaps honorable pride, I don't know. Oh, my dear, all my life has been a dream. I was always dreaming, forever dreaming, but did not live. I was proud, I despised the herd, and in what was I superior to other people? I don't know. Purity of heart, generosity of feeling. But all that was dreaming, Zina, when we read Shakespeare together. But when it came to action, I showed my purity and generosity of feeling." "Hush," said Zina, "hush! All that is not so. It is useless. You are killing yourself." "Why do you stop me, Zina? I know you have forgiven me, and perhaps you forgave me long ago, but you judged me and understood the sort of man I am. That is what torments me. I am unworthy of your love, Zina. You were honest and great-souled in action, too. You went to your mother and said that you would marry me and no one else, and you would have kept your word, because with you words were not apart from action. Well, when it came to action, do you know, Zina, I did not understand then what you would be sacrificing in marrying me. I did not even understand that marrying me you might die of starvation. I never even thought of it. I only thought that you would marry me, a great poet, a future one, that is. I would not understand the reasons you brought forward, begging me to put off our marriage. I tormented you, bullied you, reproached you, despised you, and it came at last to my threatening you with that letter. I was not even a scoundrel at that moment. I was simply a worm. Oh, how you must have despised me. Yes, it is well that I am dying. It is well that you did not marry me. I should have understood nothing of your sacrifice. I should have tormented you. I should have worried you over our poverty. The years would have passed, and who knows, perhaps I should have grown to hate you as a hindrance in my life. Now it is better. Now at least my bitter tears have purified my heart. Ah, Zinotchka, love me a little as you used to love me once, in this last hour at least. I know, of course, that I do not deserve your love, but, oh, my angel!" Several times in the course of this speech, Zina, sobbing herself, tried to stop him. But he did not listen to her. He was tormented by a longing to express himself, and he went on speaking, though with difficulty, gasping in a hoarse and choking voice. "If you hadn't met me, if you hadn't loved me, you would have lived," said Zina. "Oh, why did we meet?" "No, my darling, do not reproach yourself with my dying," the sick man went on. "I am the only person to blame for everything. How much vanity there was in it, romantic foolishness. Have they told you my foolish history, Zina? You see, 2 years ago there was a convict here, a criminal and murderer, but when it came to punishment, he turned out to be the most cowardly creature. Knowing that they would not flog a sick man, he got hold of some spirit, put tobacco in it, and drank it. He was attacked with such violent sickness, vomiting blood, and it lasted so long that it affected his lungs. He was moved to the hospital, and within a few months he died of rapid consumption. Well, my angel, I thought of that convict that very day, you know, after that note, and made up my mind to destroy myself in the same way. But why do you think I chose consumption? Why didn't I strangle myself or drown myself? Was I afraid of immediate death? Perhaps it was that, but I keep fancying, Zinotchka, that even in this I could not lay aside romantic foolishness. Anyway, I had in my mind at the time the thought, how picturesque it would be, here I should lie in bed dying of consumption, while you would be distressed and unhappy at having sent me into consumption. You would come to me confessing yourself guilty, would fall on your knees before me. I should forgive you, should die in your arms. It was silly, Zinotchka, silly, wasn't it?" "Don't speak of it," said Zina. "Don't say that. You are not like that. Let us remember rather something else that was good and happy in our past." "It is bitter to me, my darling. That is why I talk of it. I haven't seen you for 1.5 years. I should like to open my heart to you now. You know, ever since then I have been utterly alone, and I think there has not been one moment when I have not thought of you, my precious one. And do you know what, Zinotchka? How I longed to do something, to deserve that you should change your opinion of me. Until lately I did not believe that I should die. You know I was not laid up at first. For a long time I was walking about after my lungs were affected. And what absurd projects I had! I dreamed, for instance, of becoming all at once a great poet, and publishing in the Notes of the Fatherland a poem unlike anything in the world. I thought of pouring into it all my feelings, all my soul, so that wherever you might be, I should be with you, always reminding you of me with my poem. And the very best of my dreams was that you would think at last and say, 'No, he is not such a bad man as I thought.' It was stupid, Zinotchka, wasn't it?" "No, no, Vasya, no," said Zina. She fell on his breast and kissed his hands. "And how jealous I was of you all this time! I believe I should have died if I had heard of your marriage. I kept watch on you, I spied. She was constantly going." And he nodded toward his mother. "You did not love Mozgliakov, did you, Zinotchka? Oh, my angel, will you remember me when I am dead? I know you will remember, but years will pass, the heart will grow harder, you will grow cold, there will be winter in your soul, and you will forget me, Zinotchka." "No, no, never. I shall not marry. You are my first, and mine forever." "Everything dies, Zinotchka, even memories, and our noble feelings die. Common sense takes their place. What is the use of repining? Make use of life, Zina. Live long, live happily. Love someone else if you can love. There is no loving the dead. Only think of me from time to time. Do not remember what was bad. Forgive the bad. But you know there was good too in our love, Zinotchka. Oh, golden days that never can return. Listen, my angel, I always loved the evening hour of sunset. Think of me sometimes at that hour. Oh, no, no, why die? Oh, how I long to come back to life again. Remember, my dear, remember that time. It was spring then, the sun was shining so brightly, the flowers were in blossom, it was like a holiday all round us. And now look, look." And with a wasted hand the poor fellow pointed to the dingy, frozen window. Then he clutched Zina's hands, pressed them to his eyes, and sobbed bitterly, bitterly. His sobs almost lacerated his racked breast. And the whole day he was sobbing in anguish and misery. Zina did her best to comfort him, but she was half dead with misery. She told him that she would never forget him, and that she would never love another man as she loved him. He believed her, smiled, kissed her hands, but memories of the past only kindled fresh suffering in his soul. So passed the whole day. Meanwhile, Marya Alexandrovna, in alarm, sent 12 times to Zina, entreating her to return home and not to ruin herself completely in public opinion. At last, when it was getting dark, almost beside herself with horror, she made up her mind to go to Zina herself. Calling her daughter out into the other room, she besought her almost on her knees to turn aside this last worst dagger from her heart. Zina went out to her, feeling ill. Her head was burning. She listened and did not understand her mother. Marya Alexandrovna went away at last in despair, for Zina was determined to stay the night in the dying man's house. She did not leave his bedside all night. But the sick man grew worse and worse. The day came at last, but there was no hope that the sufferer would live through it. The old mother seemed frantic. She walked about as though she could not take it in, giving her son medicines which he would not take. His agony lasted a long time. He could not speak, and only incoherent, husky sounds broke from his throat. Up to the very last moment he gazed at Zina, still sought her with his eyes, and when the light in his eyes was beginning to grow dim, he still, with a straying, uncertain hand, felt for her hand to press it in his. Meanwhile the short winter day was passing, and when the last farewell gleam of sunshine gilded the solitary frozen window of the little room, the soul of the sufferer parted from his exhausted body and floated after that last ray. The old mother, seeing her adored boy lying dead before her, clasped her hands, uttered a shriek, and threw herself upon his breast. "It is you, you snake in the grass, have been his ruin! You, accursed girl, with your ill deeds have parted us, and been his undoing!" But Zina did not hear her. She stood over the dead man as though she had lost all comprehension. At last she bent down, made the sign of the cross over him, kissed him, and walked mechanically out of the room. Her eyes were burning, her head was going round. Her agonizing experiences, her 2 nights without sleep, almost deprived her of reason. She vaguely felt that all her past had been, as it were, torn out of her heart, and that a new life was beginning, gloomy and menacing. But before she had gone 10 paces, Mozgliakov seemed to spring out of the earth before her. He seemed to be purposely lying in wait for her at that spot. "Zinaida Afanasievna," he began in a timorous whisper, looking nervously around him, for it was hardly dark yet. "Zinaida Afanasievna, of course I am an ass. That is, if you like, I am not an ass now, for, you see, anyway, I have behaved honorably. But still I am sorry for having been an ass. I am afraid I am muddled, Zinaida Afanasievna, but that is due to all sorts of reasons." Zina gazed at him almost unconsciously, and went on her way in silence. As it was difficult for 2 to go abreast on the raised wooden pavement, and as Zina did not move aside, Pavel Alexandrovitch jumped off the pavement and ran by her side below, peeping up continually into her face. "Zinaida Afanasievna," he went on, "I have reflected, and if you are willing, I am prepared to renew my offer. I am ready to forget everything, Zinaida Afanasievna, the whole disgrace, and to forgive it, but only on one condition. So long as we are here, let it all be kept secret. You will go away from here as soon as possible. I shall follow you secretly. We will be married in some remote place so that no one shall see it, and then at once we will go to Petersburg, travelling with posting horses, so you should only take a little portmanteau. Eh? Do you agree, Zinaida Afanasievna? Tell me quickly. I can't wait about. We might be seen together." Zina made no answer. She only looked at Mozgliakov, but the look was such that he understood at once, took off his hat, bowed himself off, and vanished at the first turning into a side street. "What is the meaning of it?" he thought. "That evening, the day before yesterday, she was all softness and sentiment, and took all the blame on herself. She changes from day to day, it seems." And meanwhile, one event was following another in Mordassov. A tragic circumstance had occurred. After being driven to the hotel by Mozgliakov, the old prince was taken ill the same night, and dangerously ill. The people of Mordassov heard the news next morning. Kalist Stanislavich scarcely left his bedside. In the evening there was a consultation of all the Mordassov doctors. The invitations to request their attendance were written in Latin. But in spite of the Latin, the prince had already lost consciousness, was delirious, kept asking Kalist Stanislavich to sing him a ballad, and talking about wigs. At times he seemed frightened and cried out. The doctors decided that the hospitality of Mordassov had set up inflammation of the stomach, which had somehow passed, probably on the journey, to the brain. They admitted the possibility also of some moral shock. They summed up in conclusion by saying that the prince had been for a long time past predisposed to death, and so would certainly die. On the last point they were not mistaken, for 3 days later the poor old man died at the hotel. This was a great shock to the people of Mordassov. No one had expected the affair to take such a serious turn. They flocked in crowds to the hotel where the dead body was lying. They discussed and debated, nodded their heads, and ended by severely censuring the luckless prince's murderers, understanding, of course, by that term, Marya Alexandrovna and her daughter. Everyone felt that this affair, from its extremely scandalous character, might easily gain an unpleasant publicity, would perhaps reach faraway parts, and all sorts of possibilities were talked over and discussed. All this time, Mozgliakov was in the greatest fuss and flurry, and at last his head was in a perfect whirl. He was in that state of mind when he saw Zina. His position was certainly difficult. He had brought the prince into the town. He had moved him to the hotel, and now he did not know what to do with the dead man, where to bury him, whom to inform of his death. Should the body be taken to Duhanovo? Besides, he considered himself a nephew. He trembled with apprehension that he might be blamed for the venerable old man's death. "Very likely there will be talk of it in Petersburg in the best society," he thought with a shudder. He could not extract advice of any sort from his Mordassov acquaintances. They were all overcome by sudden consternation. They rushed away from the dead body and left Mozgliakov in gloomy isolation. But all at once the scene was completely transformed. Early the next morning, a new visitor arrived in the town. Of this visitor all Mordassov instantly began talking, but they spoke of him mysteriously in a whisper, staring at him out of every chink in every window when he drove along the high street on his way to the governor's. Even Pyotr Mikhailovitch seemed overawed, and did not know what tone to take with his visitor. The visitor was no other than the renowned Prince Chapetolov, a relative of the old prince's, a man still youngish, about 35, with shoulder knots and the epaulets of a colonel. The sight of those shoulder knots struck awe into the hearts of all subordinate officials. The police master, for instance, completely lost his head. In a moral sense, of course. Physically he put in an appearance, though it was a very stiff and constrained appearance. It was at last learned that Prince Shepetolov had come from Petersburg, calling on the way at Duhanovo. Finding no one at Duhanovo, he flew off in pursuit of his uncle to Mordassov, where he had been thunderstruck by the news of the old man's death and the rumors concerning the circumstances attending it. Pyotr Mikhailovitch was actually a little nervous as he gave the necessary explanations, and indeed everyone in Mordassov had a guilty air. Moreover, the visitor had such a stern, such a dissatisfied face, though one would have thought it impossible to be dissatisfied with the fortune he was inheriting. He at once took everything into his own hands. Mozgliakov promptly and with shame effaced himself before the real, not self-styled, nephew, and vanished. No one knew where. It was decided to move the dead body at once to the monastery, where a requiem service was arranged. All the directions were given by the old prince's kinsman briefly, dryly, and sternly, but with tact and decorum. Next day all the town assembled at the monastery to hear the requiem service. An absurd rumor was current among the ladies that Marya Alexandrovna would appear at the church in person, and on her knees before the coffin would pray aloud for forgiveness, and that this all had to be done in accordance with the law. All this, of course, proved to be nonsense, and Marya Alexandrovna did not come to the church. We forgot to say that immediately after Zina's return to the house, her mother decided that very evening to move to their country house, considering it impossible to remain longer in the town. There she listened anxiously from her seclusion to the rumors from the town, sent to find out about the new arrival, and was all the time in a state of fever. The road from the monastery to Ducreux passed less than 3/4 of a mile from her windows, and so Marya Alexandrovna could command a convenient view of the long procession which stretched from the monastery to Ducreux after the service. The coffin was upon a high hearse, and after it stretched a long string of carriages, escorting it to the point where the road turns off to the town. And that gloomy hearse could be seen a long way further, a black patch against the white snow-covered plain, moving slowly with becoming dignity. But Marya Alexandrovna could not look at it long. She walked away from the window. A week later she moved to Moscow with her daughter and Afanasy Matveyich, and a month later the news reached Mordassov that Marya Alexandrovna's country house, as well as her town house, were for sale. And so this comme-il-faut lady was lost to Mordassov forever. Even this could not pass without ill-natured jibes. It was asserted, for instance, that Afanasy Matveyich was being sold with their country place. 1 year passed, and then a second, and Marya Alexandrovna was almost forgotten. Alas, that is how it always is in life. It was said, however, that she had bought another country place and had moved to another provincial town, where, of course, she had already taken control of everything, that Zina was still unmarried, that Afanasy Matveyich... However, it is hardly worth while to repeat these rumors. They were all very untrustworthy. 3 years have passed since I wrote the last line of the first part of my Mordassov chronicle, and who would have supposed that I should have occasion to open my manuscript again and to add another piece of news to my story? Well, here it is. I will begin with Pavel Alexandrovich Mozgliakov. When he disappeared from Mordassov, he went straight to Petersburg, where he successfully obtained the post in the service that had long been promised him. He soon forgot all the incidents at Mordassov, threw himself into the vortex of social life on Vasilyevsky Island, and had a gay time of it, flirted, kept up with the times, fell in love, made an offer, swallowed another refusal, and before he had digested it, was led by idleness and the frivolity of his character to get for himself a post on an expedition which was being sent to one of the remotest borders of our boundless fatherland, for inspection or for some other object, I don't know for certain what. The party successfully traversed all the forests and deserts, and at last, after long peregrinations, arrived in the chief town of that remote region to call on the Governor-General. He was a tall, lean, stern general, an old military man who had been often wounded in battle, and had 2 stars and a white cross on his breast. He received the expedition with dignity and decorum, and invited all the officials to a ball which was to be given that very evening on the occasion of the name-day of the governor's wife. Pavel Alexandrovich was very much pleased. Attiring himself in his Petersburg suit, in which he intended to produce an effect, he walked with a free and easy air into the big reception hall, but he was at once somewhat taken aback at the sight of the numbers of thick and plated epaulets and civilian uniforms with stars on their breasts. He had to pay his respects to the governor's wife, of whom he had heard that she was young and very good-looking. He went up to her, indeed, with aplomb, but was suddenly petrified with amazement. Before him stood Zina, in a resplendent ball dress and diamonds, looking proud and haughty. She completely failed to recognize Pavel Alexandrovich. Her eyes glided over his face and at once turned to someone else. Astounded, Pavel Alexandrovitch moved to one side, and in the crowd came into collision with a timid young official who seemed to be frightened at finding himself at the governor's ball. Pavel Alexandrovitch immediately began to question him and learned the most interesting facts. He learned that the governor had married 2 years ago when he had visited Moscow, and that he had married a very wealthy young lady of a distinguished family, that the governor's wife was awfully good-looking, even one might say a beauty of the first order, but that she behaved extremely proudly and only danced with generals, that at the present ball there were in all 9 generals, their own and visitors, including the actual civil councillors, that the governor's wife had a mamma who lived with her, and that this mamma belonged to the highest society and was very clever, but that the mamma herself was completely dominated by the daughter, while the general himself simply doted on his spouse. Mozgliakov faltered a question about Afanasy Matveyitch, but they had no conception of his existence in the remote region. Regaining his confidence a little, Mozgliakov walked about the rooms and soon saw Marya Alexandrovna, gorgeously attired, brandishing a costly fan and talking with animation to a personage of the 4th class. Round her clustered several ladies, evidently anxious to propitiate her, and Marya Alexandrovna was apparently very gracious to all of them. Mozgliakov ventured to introduce himself. Marya Alexandrovna seemed a little startled, but almost instantly recovered herself. She graciously condescended to recognize Pavel Alexandrovitch, questioned him about Petersburg acquaintances, asked him why he was not abroad. To Mordassov she made no allusion whatever, as though such a place had no existence on earth. At last, after mentioning the name of a distinguished Petersburg prince and inquiring after his health, though Mozgliakov had no acquaintance whatever with the prince in question, she turned imperceptibly to a grand personage who was approaching, whose grey locks were fragrant with scent, and a minute later had completely forgotten Pavel Alexandrovitch, though he remained standing before her. With his hat in his hand and a sarcastic smile on his face, Mozgliakov returned to the great hall. Considering for some unknown reasons that he was insulted and even wounded, he resolved not to dance. A morose and absent expression and a biting Mephistophelian smile never left his face the whole evening. He leaned in a picturesque attitude against a column. As luck would have it, there were columns in the hall, and during the whole ball, that is, for several hours together, he remained standing at the same place, watching Zina. But alas, all his antics, all his striking attitudes, his disillusioned air, and all the rest of it were thrown away. Zina completely failed to observe him. At last, enraged and with legs aching from long standing, hungry because as an unhappy lover he could not remain to supper, he returned to his lodgings quite worn out and feeling as though he had been beaten by someone. For a long while he did not go to bed, recalling the past which he had so long forgotten. Next morning new instructions arrived, and with relief Mozgliakov succeeded in being entrusted with the execution of them. He felt positively lighter-hearted as he drove out of the town. Snow was lying like a dazzling shroud over the boundless, deserted plain. In the distance, on the very horizon, stretched dark forests. The mettlesome horses dashed along, flinging the powdery snow with their hoofs. The sledge bell tinkled. Pavel Alexandrovitch sank into thought, and then into dreams, and then into a sweet sleep. He awoke at the third posting station, feeling fresh and well, with quite different thoughts in his mind. This concludes Uncle's Dream. I will be appending one final video to this sequence with some concluding thoughts on the novel. You are welcome to join me there. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this Let's Read experience.